Good. So we're talking about, the gospel according to. So we're talking, John Calvin talks about this idea, if all truth is God's truth, if it is indeed truth, then it comes from God. And so regardless, what he says is regardless of the source where that truth comes from, if it is indeed God's truth, then we should embrace it as such. And not pay attention to the source from where it comes from. Can you turn this mic down a smidge? It feels like it's incredibly hot. So this has been the big idea behind this series. We've been trying to look at a number of different areas in pop culture, basically, and seeking to find God's truth in places where we might not necessarily normally look for it. And that's been the big thing. And so I hope you've learned some things through this series. It's been kind of fun. We've looked at the gospel according to like Dr. Seuss and Facebook and the Hunger Games and all sorts of different fun things. If you've missed any of those previous weeks of messages, they're all available on our website, and I'd encourage you to go back and listen to those things. I'd encourage you to check them out. This week, being our final week, we hope to go out with a bang. And we'll be looking at this week the gospel according to Lady Gaga. Yeah. I had planned on wearing my meat dress this morning, but apparently I laid out my clothes too early and it's spoiled, so thought I'd spare you guys the smell. Those of you who aren't familiar, there's the famous meat dress, by the way, but those of you who aren't familiar with Lady Gaga, there's some pictures scrolling so you can see sort of who she is. Lady Gaga is, if you don't know who she is, she's undoubtedly a very eccentric personality, as you can see from some of the pictures that are scrolling. She's known for her wild wardrobe and her ability to really constantly push the envelope. As often happens with people with very eccentric personalities, people often respond to her with very polar extremes. They either love her and are totally obsessed with her, or they can't stand her and want to have nothing to do with her. Lady Gaga has by no means confessed to be a Christian, and has in fact caught a lot of flack from the mainline Christian community for some things she's done, including a song that she recently did called Judas, where she, in the music video, provides a very unique and warped representation of Jesus and the disciples. It still has some I think there's some interesting truth to examine in it, but anyway, she's caught a lot of flack for it from the Christian community because of that, as well as a lot of other controversial statements she's made and things she's done. And so I say all that up front because I recognize that for some, the person of Lady Gaga is a controversial place to search for God's truth. And I'm very aware of that going into this message. Saying that, though, I also recognize and want to challenge us that Jesus was no stranger to controversy. In fact, the things he said and the things he did were so controversial that the religious community had him executed. So if you have your Bibles, let's open up to Matthew chapter 9. We're going to look at a few verses from Matthew 9 this morning, starting at verse 9 if you want to follow along. Matthew 9, starting at verse 9, it says this. It says, "As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him." Now let's stop there for just a second, okay? I want to unpack this as we go. There are some things, contextually speaking, in this passage that you may not naturally see at first glance, but I want to point them out this morning. We read in Matthew 9:9 that Jesus stopped at this tax collector's booth and he asked this guy named Matthew to come and follow him. You're all thinking, so what? What's the big deal? Well, what you need to understand is that in that day, tax collectors were considered by the religious community to be some of the worst sinners. They were the worst of the worst. See, tax collectors were employed by the government to go around and collect taxes from the people. But there was really no system in place to really regulate how much they collected. And so it was a common practice among the tax collectors to extort a lot of money from the people they were collecting taxes from and take huge amounts for themselves. These guys were considered the scum of the earth. And you just don't associate with tax collectors. So when Jesus, as a good Jewish rabbi, goes up to this tax collector's booth and he invites Matthew, the tax collector, to become one of his disciples, what you need to understand, it was scandalous for him to do that. Like, this is the scum of the earth. As good Jewish religious guy, you don't even associate with those people, let alone ask them to be one of your followers. Being a disciple, being asked by a Jewish rabbi to be a disciple was a big deal. And so this is pretty scandalous what he did. Not only did he invite Matthew, the tax collector, to be his disciple, but the passage goes on then. If you look at verse 10, it says this: while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. So not only did he invite one of the worst of sinners to be his disciples, he and his disciples were hanging out with all of these sinners. Other passages talk about how Jesus had become known as the friend of sinners. That's what people were calling him, the friend of sinners. This, by the way, was not an affectionate term. We take it now as Christians and go, oh, isn't that sweet? That's nice. He loves sinful people. That was not a nice thing they were calling him. Because as a good Jewish rabbi, you were holy. You were supposed to be separate. And these were not just people that Jesus was reaching out to and being charitable to. These were people that they were hanging out with. These were their friends. Hence, he was the friend of sinners. And so we read on then in verse 11. It says, when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, knowing what we know about the context of this passage and who the Pharisees were, this was not an innocent, sweet, inquisitive question that they were asking of Jesus. They weren't approaching him and saying, that's curious, why in the world is he doing that? We want to learn. They weren't just curious why Jesus would do this. This was very much an accusational question. They're asking, why in the world is your teacher, who is supposed to be a respectable Jewish rabbi, holy and set apart, why in the world is he eating and hanging out with these people? Why in the world? How dare you do this sort of thing? And the passage ends in verse 12. On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Verse 13, but go and learn what this means. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So let me ask you this question this morning. When was the last time you dined with sinners? When was the last time you hung out with the outcasts? Not simply for the sake of doing a good deed or for the sake of charity, but genuinely befriended someone who didn't fit in, who didn't fit the religious box, the religious norm. How often do we as Christians understand the words and the actions of Christ in passages like these? How often do we understand that our call is not to build our own religious bubble and to keep the world out of it, but to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth? So you're probably asking yourself, what does all this have to do with the gospel according to Lady Gaga? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because I'll tell you. As I alluded to already, I think there is an interesting parallel in the controversial personas of both Jesus and Lady Gaga. Now hear me when I say that. That's not to say by any means that all of the values represented by Lady Gaga represent the values of Jesus. Of course not. That's silly. But one of the things that strikes me as I look at both Jesus and Lady Gaga is that a big part of the controversy that surrounds them is in the people that they willingly choose to relate to. And I think there's something for us to learn in that. So the big idea I really want to focus on this morning is this. Regardless of where Lady Gaga stands on God and on Christianity or even religion in general, she's undoubtedly one who identifies with what it means to be an outcast. If you hear her story, that's all about what it's how she was bullied and picked on as a kid, and she's made it, because of that, she's made it a big part of her mission to be a voice for those who are marginalized by society, pushed to the side. Which, interestingly, is something which we see reflected in the very nature of Jesus Christ and who he was in his own personal mission. And this is the guy we're called to follow. And so the big question for us is that I want to address is what can God teach us through the example of Jesus and people like Lady Gaga who are willing to stand up for those who are pushed to the margins of society? What can we learn from them? Because again, as John Calvin said and made his case, all truth is God's truth, and so it really doesn't matter where it comes from. If it comes from a preacher or if it comes from someone who's way outside the circle of Christianity. If it's truth, it's God's truth, and we should embrace it as such. Those of you who follow Lady Gaga probably know that she affectionately calls her fans little monsters. And she's Mama Monster. Which is kind of funny, isn't it? I mean, that she would refer. But by that, she means freaks. She's talking about freaks. I'm a freak, you're a freak, and she sings about it a lot. She's talking about the odd, the weird, the lonely, the rejects. These are the people she's reaching out to, the nerds, the cast-offs. In light of the Gospels, and even the passage that we just looked at, it's hard not to take a look at this same demographic of people when you look at the life and the teachings of Jesus. On his blog and in his book titled Unclean, Richard Beck, who is the professor and department chair of psychology at Abilene Christian University, he writes about the theology of monsters, which is really interesting. If you get a chance, you can Google it. You can find some of his materials actually on his blog. But he does this whole theology of monsters and looking at the examples of monsters throughout Scripture and throughout society. But he ultimately poses the question, can we and should we show hospitality to monsters? And in his writing, he explores how there's a lot of mystery that surrounds this category of monster. People or things that we call monsters. He says, on the surface, the monster is a threat. It's a source of defilement and moral and communal harm. Okay? Monsters on the surface are something that's going to harm us personally, that we think they're going to harm us personally, and they're going to harm society. Thus, monsters are usually expelled from community. And yet, he says, what's interesting, most monster stories that you hear suggest that the monster is often a scapegoat. That the monster is more the victim than the victimizer. Underneath it, if we could see it, the monster is really one of us. And often through various circumstances within or outside of their own control, they're made to be a monster. Does that make sense? How that works, how that unfolds. And as we read through the Gospels, we see time and time again Jesus engaging with the monsters, the quote-unquote monsters of society, those who had been pushed to the side and expelled from community because of what they had done. And what's interesting about Jesus is he sees through all the facades that they put up. Because monsters, when they're put into the category of being a monster, they have a tendency to put up this hard exterior shell, don't they? To keep people out. Jesus, interestingly, has this uncanny ability to see right through all those facades, and he speaks right to the place where their own personal woundedness lies.